Welcome to the third episode in a Legendarium series about the Viking invasions. This episode is called The First Norman Conquest. During this episode, we'll be talking about the role that Viking women played in combat, possibly. Then we'll talk about King Alfred's war against Guthrum, which saw the famous Battle of Chippenham and climaxed at the Battle of Eddington, which likely freed Wessex from Viking rule and marked the beginning of the end of Viking rule in England. Then we'll talk about the Viking invasion of Frankia, the rise of Rollo the Walker, and how he became the first Duke of Normandy. Though the Vikings had raided England since 793, in 865 a Viking fleet arrived in East Anglia, not just to raid, but to found a new kingdom. One aspect of this army that might have shocked Christians at the time would be the presence of female warriors. Viking lore had many examples of female warriors, including the Valkyries said to escort dead warriors to heaven, and Hervor, a shield maiden who was the daughter of a famous berserker, and after defeating every boy in her village at wrestling matches, she sought adventure and glory in the wide world. Yet it was long assumed that while Viking women could hold power in managing households, raising children, and directing trade, it was historically assumed that women did not join in combat. However, a recent discovery of a woman buried with weapons in Birka, Sweden, indicates that at least some Viking women may have joined men in combat. Women warriors or not, by 872 the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of East Anglia, Northumbria, and Mercia were firmly under Viking rule. Of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, only Wessex survived, and they did so because young King Alfred of Wessex paid Halfdan the Viking a hefty bribe or Danegeld in exchange for not killing him, the fate of many other Anglo-Saxon kings. Halfdan kept the peace, but another Danish monarch named Guthrum did not. Alfred's military was weak, based on a peasant militia called the Fyrd, which took time to call up and would go home for the harvest if a siege dragged on too long. And in the dead of winter 876, Guthrum marched 120 miles on back roads in secret, avoiding Alfred's scouts. And he took the city of Wareham by surprise, expecting reinforcements from Scandinavia to help him complete the conquest of Wessex. Alfred raised the Fyrd and surrounded Wareham in a siege that lasted a full year. And after that time, both Guthrum and Alfred were in a difficult spot. Guthrum had no reinforcements coming and was running out of supplies, and Alfred's men were starting to go home to tend to the harvest. So the two sides negotiated. Alfred paid Guthrum treasure in exchange for hostages and an oath never to return to Wessex. Guthrum agreed, and the two kings exchanged treasure, hostages, and oaths to keep the peace. And the moment he could, Guthrum killed Alfred's hostages, took his army north, and seized the fully provisioned fort of Exeter. In effect, Alfred paid Guthrum to move house. There was another siege that lasted for almost a year until Guthrum finally accepted defeat, gave Alfred hostages while taking none, and went home to Mercia apparently cowed. On Epiphany Day 877, Alfred held a feast with his nobles at Chippenham, the royal seat of Wessex, trying to patch things up after his poor performance with Guthrum. Little did he know that Guthrum had used the Danegeld that Alfred paid him to bribe a few key Wessex noblemen. Guthrum surrounded and overwhelmed the royal seat at Chippenham, knowing the Anglo-Saxons would be drunk on wassail during their 12th night celebrations. The army of Wessex scattered as Alfred fled with his family and a few retainers into the marshlands of Somerset. For a time it looked as if England would become Daneland. Instead, Alfred built a marsh fort and launched hit-and-run raids against the Danes. Parties of Alfred's men torched Viking camps and made off with weapons. The Danish war parties that went into the marshes to look for the fugitive king vanished, only to turn up dead on the road a few days later. As word spread that the former king lived and fought, his former Huscarls made their way to the Somerset marshes to join Alfred, where his army grew and grew. By autumn 878, Alfred had a force large enough to challenge Guthrum, and instead of taking back his kingdom a piece at a time, he confronted Guthrum in a final battle. If Alfred lost, not only would he lose his title and his life, but England would probably become a Danish colony. and Guthrum chose the battlefield outside Chippenham, using an old Iron Age hill fort, now just a mound of grassy earth. But the Anglo-Saxons would still have to climb over a ditch and slog uphill in the face of a rain of arrows to meet Guthrum. And Alfred did just that, his men holding the shield wall together as they faced an arrow rain. And when the two shield walls finally met, they pressed against each other, the sheer weight of opposing forces crushing those at the center together. Men screamed face to face, stabbed at exposed feet, groin, and faces in a bloody, heaving nightmare. There was little room for strategy, only a grim determination to hold the line. In the end, Guthrum decided to save his own skin and ran away, after 6 days of battle. And when the Vikings saw their leader fleeing, they broke ranks. The Anglo-Saxons chased them and slaughtered them in terrible numbers. After 6 days of battle, there were almost 2,000 dead. Utterly cowed by his latest defeat, Guthrum converted to Christianity as part of making peace with Alfred. Alfred himself shoved Guthrum into the baptismal pool, and he was forcibly invited to a Christmas feast, where he accepted gifts just like any Anglo-Saxon thane. And Guthrum, either out of religious conviction or just a personal choice, kept his treaty with Alfred and maintained peace along Alfred's eastern border for 11 years until his death. And during that peace after the Battle of Eddington, Alfred used his time well. He began a new strategy against the Vikings, fortifying his borders with hill forts to stop further attacks. Whenever Alfred gained ground, he built another chain of forts to hold this new territory. He also created new laws aimed at ending the blood feuds that often followed any assault or murder. But it's also worth noting that the Vikings brought a lot more than just the fire and the sword to England. The Danes began migrating to England after the conquest. Almost 35,000 of them came, driven from their homeland by a series of crop failures and the promise of a milder climate in the British Isles. Of course, the leaders of great warbands like Guthrum dreamed of making themselves king, but the sons of peasants had more modest dreams. Most of the Danes streaming into England, often the second sons of peasants, took up farming. They cleared forests and drained swamps, bringing land under cultivation that never knew the plow before. In addition, the Viking power center of York became England's greatest trade center during the Viking Age. As Wessex reconquered England, many of these Danes put family ties before national pride, with peasants and jarls alike making peace with English rule rather than abandon their ancestral holdings. Indeed, Earl Godwin and Harold Godwinson, among the last rulers of Anglo-Saxon England, were of Danish descent. With their fortunes in England waning, Vikings bent on war found France to be a more profitable venture. During the collapse of Charlemagne's empire, warlords hired Vikings as mercenaries until the Vikings realized it was easier and more profitable to plunder Frankish monasteries. In 845, they even grew bold enough to lay siege to Paris, and King Charles the Bald paid them 7,000 silver coins to simply leave. While it may have bought peace for a summer, it also sent a signal to the Viking warlords throughout Scandinavia that they simply needed to take a town and stay there until the local magnate paid them a hefty bribe to leave. Soon the sight of Viking longships on the rivers Seine and Loire became commonplace. Viking warlords stabled their horses in churches and sacrificed priests at their own altars. They even devised a new method for extorting money. If a big shot proved reluctant to pay up, the Vikings stuck a dagger into his nostril and slit open his nose, which may have given us the phrase, pay through the nose. So it's no surprise that the remnants of the great heathen army which invaded England in 865 would go to Frankia in search of greener pastures. In 885, one of these veterans, Rollo the Walker, arrived in France and began ravaging the south of the country. He was said to be so tall and large that no horse could carry him for long, so he became known as Rollo Ganger or Rollo the Walker. By the 890s, Rollo had made himself rich, in part because a succession of Frankish kings had paid Viking raiders 120,000 silver coins, more than one-third of all the silver coins that Frankia minted. And while this made warlords like Rollo very rich, as the silver supply ran out, the Franks had no choice but to find their courage. In the year 911, Rollo the Walker was leading a force of longships down the Jura River, laying siege to the city of Chartres. If he hoped for another quick victory followed by a hefty ransom, Rollo was surprised. As his warband approached the city gates, Rollo was stunned to see the Bishop of Chartres emerge, a cross and reliquary in his hands, and a horde of peasants at his back, outnumbering the Vikings 10-1. Rollo had no choice but to fall back towards the Jura River, and soon afterwards the Frankish army of King Charles the Simple arrived. As night fell, Rollo ordered his men to slaughter all the animals they had and pile them up in a wall of bloodied offal. When the Frankish cavalry tried to charge, their horses recoiled at the stench of blood, and the Vikings streamed over their wall of dead animals and slaughtered all of the Frankish knights. However, they still faced that peasant horde which outnumbered them 10-1. King Charles the Simple then had an idea. Knowing that other Vikings would soon return with the next summer, he offered Rollo a choice between death and glory. They could either fight it out and Rollo would probably die, or Rollo could accept land and title. By now in his 50s, Rollo was interested in securing a legacy, and he took the offer. He was made the Duke of Normandy, rulers of the land at the mouth of the English Channel to defend against other Viking raiders. To be sure, the creation of Rollo as Duke of Normandy did not go smoothly. To get his land and title, he had to kiss the foot of King Charles. Finding that distasteful, Rollo delegated the task to a subordinate. Said subordinate simply yanked the royal foot up so hard that King Charles wound up falling on his backside. Even more irksome, during the mass baptism held for Rollo's men, some of the priests learned that a number of Vikings got themselves baptized half a dozen times so that they could get more free baptismal robes. Rollo himself did accept baptism, but upon his death he gave both 100 silver coins to the church and had 100 men sacrificed to Odin to hedge his bets. Despite that, Rollo's descendants soon assimilated into Frankish life, becoming devout Christians and French speakers. They also conquered kingdoms in Sicily and southern Italy, led several crusades, and of course, Rollo's great-great-grandson William the Bastard did what his Viking ancestors couldn't do, invading and conquering England in 1066. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, please press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, please let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.